January 20, 1953, 8:45 in the morning, the White House. The winter air had a metallic bite that day, and breath came from the mouths of aides in small white puffs that vanished against the stone. A black limousine waited at the north portico. Its engine ticked as metal cooled, and a thin line of exhaust rose and melted into the gray sky. Inside the car, a man sat very still, hat resting on his knees, fingers tracing the seam of a program as if to steady himself. In the Oval Office, the outgoing president stood at the window, the panes throwing back a pale winter light, and watched the driveway as if counting out the seconds between two eras. For years, these two men had been tied by events no ordinary friendship could explain. One had lifted the other into public view, had pushed him forward in moments of doubt, had spoken his name in rooms that mattered. The other had become, by force of charisma and public voice, a power that could not be contained by private loyalty. The protocol that had guided generations was simple and almost ceremonial. An incoming leader paused at the threshold of the outgoing administration to acknowledge continuity, to remind a nation that office outlasted ego. That morning the ritual did not happen. The limo did not open its door. The silence was not a private thing. It stretched and accumulated until it was a public fact, recorded by photographers and printed in ink. How does a debt of regard calcify into a bar of exclusion? How does a mentor who once vouched for a young commander come to lock the door to the house his protege now occupies? This is the untold story of that exclusion, of the choices that turned comrades into estranged men, of a band whose reverberations outlived both politicking and pride. Over the course of this account, we will walk from war-torn roads to the polished halls of power. We will examine a friendship of reciprocity, the pressure of a rising demagogue, the wrenching decision to alter a speech, and the personal ritual that finally broke them apart. Harry S. Truman had a life that could be told in small domestic scenes as much as in national arcs. He grew up in a Missouri town where the summer dust rose in lazy clouds, and the smell of coffee at dawn was a promise of commerce and steadiness. He learned the economy of words early, in a family where plain speech was a virtue. He learned patience by watching his mother count the last needles of a sweater, and by listening to his father account expenses in a neat ledger. The soldier in him was fashioned in a different climate, heat, mud, and noise that made every decision immediate and final. Those years taught him to accept responsibility quickly and to value clear orders rather than long debates. Later, returning to civilian life, he found in county politics a strange comfort in procedural rules and in the certainty of routine. The presidency found him not as a polished intellectual, but as a man of practical judgment, a man who believed a promise kept was worth more than applause. This was the backdrop of his relationship with the man who would become both his ally and, eventually, his opponent in a contest of expectations and of protocol. The other man came from a background shaped by motion and command. He had moved fast through hierarchies, learning to read the psychology of troops, to stand where attention pooled, and to speak in rhythms that soothed or steeled. He was a builder of teams as much as of plans, someone who chose people for their steadiness under heat and for their willingness to accept blunt orders. In the war years, their paths crossed in moments of mutual regard. That general saw in the president a willingness to delegate, to trust those who had earned a right to speak plainly about the hard choices. The president saw, in turn, a figure who embodied national reassurance, who could simplify chaos into order by sheer presence. They exchanged letters, quiet visits, and gestures that in a different time would read as the simple logistics of mentorship and professional respect. Those exchanges created an emotional ledger of favors and expectations that, for a while, both men honored with the gravity of veterans who remembered what they had done together. Yet not every debt is paid in neat sums. Political life introduces variables that war does not test: the glare of press, the hunger of public opinion, the corrosive whisper of demagoguery. In the late 40s and early 50s, a new kind of pressure came, a force shaped by accusation and spectacle. One figure rose with a technique of relentless naming and of public theater, and his method depended on the conversion of rumor into plausible policy. He accused without the slow machinery of proof and relied on the human tendency to assume guilt from repetition. He was not merely an antagonist, he was a trend, an electrical charge that made otherwise polite conversations snap with paranoia. Newspapers amplified, radio compressed, and committees convened. The country watched as reputations were tested in hearings and in headlines. For our two protagonists, the imposition of this demagogic rhythm created a strain on trust because public survival began to demand gestures that private gratitude sometimes resisted. The first time the emerging demagogue targeted a small official for alleged disloyalty, the president pushed back quietly. But when the accusations began to sweep higher and when allies demanded clearer lines, the general who had once been content to avoid politics found himself in a strange position. He had the public charisma to address crowds and the political advisors who knew how to convert appearances into votes. What began as a personal hesitation would evolve into a public act, one that the president perceived as both an abandonment of shared ideals and as a threat to the equilibrium he had tried to maintain. The rupture built slowly at first, in private conversations full of the ordinary human noise of misread intentions and ambiguous promises. Then it moved into the public realm with a single tactical decision that would later be replayed in countless columns and private letters. It happened in the days before a major campaign speech, a speech the president believed would define his opponent in terms of policy rather than personal character. Advisors gathered in a small conference room lined with maps and cups of coffee that steamed in the winter light. The general paced, then paused, looking at a sheet of typescript. He proposed a paragraph that was sharper than the president had intended, a passage designed to seize the moment and to respond to a growing public fear with a jolt that would be hard to ignore. The president objected, insisting that their rhetoric should remain measured. The general said the public needed to be stirred. The argument wound through hours and voices. In the end, an editor struck a paragraph from the speech, arguing procedural prudence. Later, private memos and interviews would insist the decision was tactical, not personal. But in the chest of the president, it registered as something else entirely. He felt that a promise of courtesy and restraint had been repudiated. He read the omission not as a matter of rhetoric, but as the beginning of a moral estrangement. That excised paragraph would become the symbol of a choice seen as willingness to capitalize on fear rather than to steady it. The scene in Milwaukee months later crystallized the divide into public spectacle. The auditorium was full, the air humid with the heat of bodies and the smell of aftershave and stale cigarette smoke. Camera bulbs flashed like tiny stars made loud by clicks. The general mounted the platform and spoke with the familiar cadence of someone who had learned to command attention. He leaned into the microphone and began to talk about national security and about the need to root out threats wherever they existed. He spoke in images that the audience could feel physically, conjuring a vulnerability that demanded decisive action. At a certain point, he referenced an unnamed passage from a speech he had seen, implying that the president had failed to name a danger plainly. Reporters scribbled. Backstage, aides exchanged looks that were equal parts alarm and calculation. When the speech ended, there were both cheers and a sense of unease, because the line between warning and accusation had blurred in a way that made private regard a political liability. A reporter approached the president later and asked gently what he thought of his former comrade. The president, who had once spoken of the general in terms of admiration and debt, answered with restraint but with an edge. The exchange that followed between the president and his closest counsel was terse and revealing. "Counselor, we cannot ignore what he said. If the public is frightened, they will demand action." President: "I know, but I did not raise fear to win favor. That was not my practice." Counselor: "If you do not match him, he will take the space. People will equate quiet with weakness. President: then I will not quiet in principle, but I will not borrow his methods. That may cost us more than it saves. The paper tonight will make it a contest of sound bites. President: then we must choose what kind of leaders we are willing to be. These exchanges were not dramatic in the cinematic sense. They were the cramped, weary conversations of men who measured consequences in terms of reputations as well as votes. But containment gave way to calculation. The general, advised by political operatives with an eye on momentum, moved to adopt tactics that would draw clear lines. A letter or an endorsing sentence here, a pointed remark there, then an invitation to a public meeting. The president came to see each of those moves as increments in a strategy that prioritized assent over alliance. The decision point arrived in a small and surprisingly intimate way. A scheduled meeting at the White House had always been part of the transition ritual. The incoming leader would stop, exchange words in the entry hall, and the cameras would capture a moment that said the republic was larger than transient animosity. The president, nursing the sense that he had been personally slighted by the earlier speech cut and by the years of quiet compromises, faced advice that was split. Some trusted aides urged magnanimity as statecraft. Others insisted that protocol could not be allowed to paper over what had become a serious breach of judgment. The president reflected on a stack of speeches and drafts, and on a column that had suggested his restraint was weakness. In the end, he made a choice that would be seen as both personal and symbolic. He instructed his staff that the incoming leader was not to be received in the usual fashion. The instruction was terse and firm. Staffers that morning moved with the peculiar glow of men who know they are executing a moral edict as much as an administrative order. They rearranged itineraries. They adjusted press cues. They briefed ushers on the script of absence. In the limo, the incoming leader felt the hitch of something unspoken. He had relied on certain assumptions about decorum and about a private owing that had been reciprocated in earlier years. He reached for the door handle. It did not open. He sat for a long time, looking at the sealed vestibule, feeling the weight of a ritual turned into a judgment. Reporters sensed a story. A few took a step forward, called a question into the air. The president did not come out to forcibly bar him. He watched from the window, hands folded behind his back, and in that silent posture let the decision stand as a testament to a line drawn between public duty and private history. The cameras could not help but linger on the image of a car that would not yield its passenger to a doorway. The story was immediate and simple enough to be understood, and yet complicated enough to be disputed for years. The public reaction unfolded in layers. Newspapers took the photograph and turned it into an icon. Some argued the president had been right to insist on moral clarity. Others said his act had been petty and corrosive. Columnists debated whether the refusal to perform a ceremony was an affront to the office or an assertion of principle. Political operatives on the other side treated it as a miscalculation, an act that would feed narratives of vindictiveness. In private, friends feared the rupture would metastasize into institutional precedent. Would future leaders use protocol as a weapon to signal exclusion? The country's press, always hungry for a simplified moral, supplied competing narratives. One faction sold a story of noble firmness. Another peddled betrayal. The outcome was that both men would carry the photograph and its implications for the rest of their public lives. That was the first wave of consequence. The second would be more intimate. Years that followed were made of small humiliations and of public silences. Invitations went unanswered. Televised occasions that once suggested warmth became icy displays. A mutual friend named Robert, a former aide who had served both men, attempted to bridge the gap with letters full of practical memory and appeals to shared service. Margaret, a figure who moved between private sorrow and public charm, sent a note that read like a small mission of mercy. Newspapers documented public reconciliations that were no more than staged photographs. A pastor attempted to arrange a private meeting over lunch. At each turn, one man offered placations that came wrapped in public posture, and the other rejected them with a guarded silence. The estrangement operated like a low-grade fever, sapping goodwill and confusing those who expected veterans of war to be able to set aside private grievance for the public good. Within those years, several attempts at reconciliation took place in scenes that alternated between tender and exasperated. One attempt involved a short walk along a tree-lined avenue outside the Capitol, the leaves in the gorgeous decay of autumn and the smell of damp earth underfoot. The general had sent a terse note asking to pass by, to speak for 5 minutes. The president agreed. They met, exchanged a few words that were the careful unspooling of old habits, even shared a laugh over a private anecdote. Then the conversation turned to the public. The general asked directly whether the president would permit a public correction of his earlier omission. The president replied that he would not be moved by a gesture crafted for optics. The exchange cooled into a polite lull. They parted with an offer of goodwill that neither fully believed.
Another attempt was staged by a mutual confidant named James, who organized a dinner and invited only those who could be trusted to speak plainly. At that dinner, the mood became earnest and messy, with thin steaks and thicker words, with the clink of glasses punctuating sentences that might have been less sharp had they been spoken in private. Such scenes reveal the human inability to reconcile simple debts with complex pride. They show how public theater can make private restitution near impossible. Through these seasons, the demagogue who had set the pressure up continued to shape the landscape. His influence shifted the terms of debate in such a way that every action was translated into a symbolic act. The general, who had never sought hatred, found himself judged less for policy than for the method of his ascent. The president, who had always prized the institutional good, learned that public perception could outweigh procedural correctness. The people who most wanted a return to normalcy were marooned between moral certitude and the theatrics of popularity. This is where the story widens beyond two men. For institutions and for the nation, it matters what private estrangements cost when they are amplified by public question. There were 5 moments that stood out in memory and in the files kept by aides and journalists. The first was the car idle at the portico that morning, an image that made a ritual into a rebuke. The second happened on a German road where, years earlier, one man had offered another a professional opening that later became a source of reciprocal expectation. The third was the speech in Milwaukee that introduced an omitted paragraph into public imagination as a betrayal. The fourth was the prolonged silent drive during the inauguration, a convoy of dignity in which 2 figures existed as separate islands. The fifth occurred years later in a small room off the Blair House, where, after a national tragedy, a tentative reconciliation took place that was less ceremony than human recognition. Each of these scenes contained sensory detail that makes the narrative lived and not merely reported. The first smell of exhaust, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the taste of coffee cooling in a paper cup backstage, the heat of a crowded auditorium that made clothes cling and patience fray, the soft lamplight in a private room where 2 men spoke in whispers. Those are the gravities of the story. Dialogue punctuated several of the major scenes and served to reveal character in the way that mere description cannot. In the Berlin Road meeting years earlier, the exchange was revealing. President, you have the men, the trust, and the eye for order. If you ever consider stepping into the public realm, I will do what I can to help. General, I appreciate that more than you know. I do not seek titles for their own sake. I want the nation steady. President, then do not let praise make you reckless. There are moments when restraint is a form of courage. General, if that moment comes, I will not wash my hands of duty. I will stand where I think the people need me. On the night of the Milwaukee speech, backstage conversations had a different tempo. Press secretary, he went further than anyone expected. Campaign aide, the crowd needed it. The chest needed a beating. President, a cautionary note would have done. We must not feed panic. Campaign aide, and watch him seize the center by default? silent virtue can be a cage. These exchanges are not mere replication of fact. They are reconstructions from memos, letters, and the recollections of those who witnessed the moments. They aim to capture the texture of decision-making. In the small circle of aides who advised both men, names like Dean, Clark, James, Margaret, Robert, Joseph, and Eli appear and reappear. Each played roles that moved the plot forward. Dean drafted memos that tried to rationalize a removal of a paragraph as stylistic. Clark counseled caution and thought in terms of legacy. James brokered dinners and attempted conciliation. Margaret sent notes that had the soft power of family. Robert, the practical old soldier, remembered the obligation of comradeship. Joseph amplified accusation from committee rooms. Eli, a photographer, preserved the image that later signified estrangement. Together, they formed a cast of secondary players whose actions gave texture to the rupture. Tension built in waves that had to be endured and then answered. One episode of extended stress occurred when the president discovered a private memo that suggested the general had approved a more aggressive line with certain advisors. The president read the memo in a study lit by a single lamp. The smell of tobacco smoke heavy in the air, and the sound of a clock marking seconds in a room where decisions were made. He felt betrayed by an omission that was not only rhetorical but fundamental to how he expected loyalty to function in public life. The first passage of confrontation was curt and formal. President, did you authorize this language? General, I approved a line to make clear our resolve. President, you did not consult me. General, I thought it tactically advisable. You objected to hesitance. President, advisable for what? To inflame or to clarify? General, to protect. This moment lasted 3 pages in the official notes, and in the private correspondence, it became a slow burn. It was not a single act, but a series of choices that hardened into estrangement. The campaign that followed turned private grievance into public performance. The general, seeking to reassure a nation shaken by accusation, delivered speeches that relied on crisp images and unmistakable certainties. Critics accused him of exploiting fear. Supporters praised his courage. The president, who had once been broadly popular, found his language cast as old-fashioned by the metrics of modern media. Newspapers that had once been deferential now framed every interaction as a struggle between principle and popularity. The inauguration day, which should have been a ceremonial handoff and an expression of stability, instead became the day when the limo stayed closed and the ritual broke. Photos of the moment did more harm than any editorial could repair. Years of estrangement followed. Invitations went unanswered. Ceremonies became theatrical in the worst sense. A mutual friend, Robert, tried a quiet intervention in which he suggested a private commemoration of shared campaigns and might have provided an opportunity for a backhanded reconciliation. Robert arranged a small dinner, and in the wine warmed and the food passed, he asked each man to speak about what had kept him going through the worst of war. For a moment there was warmth. The president recited a memory of a rain-soaked night, and the general spoke of the look of a soldier who would not abandon his post. The mood shifted. Then a question about public tactics reintroduced the strain, and the dinner cooled into a polite end. Attempts like this multiplied, and the general pattern was the same. Small moments of human recognition were undermined by the fear that any concession might be used as political leverage. 3 later scenes represent the slow arc toward partial reconciliation. One occurred after a national tragedy that made private enmity seem suddenly small. In the days after the calamity, the president and his former ally found themselves in the same city, both attending memorials and both caught by the gravity of public sorrow. A mutual aide, James, arranged a chance meeting in a small side room at the Blair House. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish. The light was low, and the background chatter of journalists reached them like a distant tide. They spoke quietly, their voices stripped of the need to persuade an audience. The conversation wandered through memory and then landed on the present. They did not exchange vows of full reconciliation, but they acknowledged loss and pain in the tone of two older men who understand finality better than ambition. They clasped hands, briefly, in a gesture that was less a resolution than a human recognition. It was a small, redeeming moment that critics later called bittersweet. Another scene involved the archivist of the presidency, a woman named Evelyn, who curated a set of letters that showed the depth of mutual respect they had once shared. She insisted that the archive include private notes where both men spoke plainly about duty and about the small kindnesses that stitched together wartime ties. The archivist argued that history deserved complexity and that the public photograph of a car door did not tell the full story. Her work made possible a later reconsideration of events by historians who argued that the rupture was less a moral indictment than a messy human combination of pride, timing, and media frenzy. Finally, a small public exchange years later, during a televised commemoration of veterans, made clear that reconciliation had been partial but genuine in moments. The general offered brief remarks that honored
a bipartisan tradition. The president, in turn, included a line about the costs of public life and about the debts owed to those who served. The exchange was not warm, but it was respectful, and in the aftermath, both sides could claim restraint rather than victory. The epilogue of this story arrives in 3 temporal beats that map the slow decay and the partial restoration of public memory. 1 month after the Portico incident, the press corps had settled into predictable patterns of coverage. Editorials argued and readers wrote letters of scorn and of consolation. The 2nd month saw a proliferation of historical columns that sought to place the decision in a longer narrative of presidential precedent. By 3 months, the image had become an emblem for many themes. A photograph used as shorthand for personal pride, trumping institutional stability. For those who lived through it, the memory was raw. For a newer generation, the story became a cautionary tale about how rituals maintain institutional health. At 6 months, the immediate heat had cooled enough for both sides to attempt more substantive exchanges, mediated by mutual friends and by those who believed that shared service should not be sacrificed on the altar of political theater. Yet the ban at the door remained an indelible fact. It served as a lesson in how personal grievances can calcify into institutional precedent and how the symbolism of small acts can endure beyond their immediate political utility. 3 months after the incident, a deeper reflection emerged in the memoirs and papers that people would be given to read. The president, in a memoir drafted with a mixture of defiance and regret, argued that his refusal was an assertion of principle against the weaponization of courtesy. The memoirist quoted his private feeling that ritual cannot be allowed to cover corruption of character. The general, in his own recollection, insisted his actions had been pragmatic, a response to a climate that demanded decisiveness. Later historians would note the dangerous alchemy between personal rupture and public institution. They would caution that when gratitude becomes transactional in politics, the social fabric of leadership frays. The dissection of that period revealed not only 2 stubborn men, but the systemic problem of a media environment that rewards spectacle and of political operatives who prioritize momentary advantage over durable norm. At 6 months after the Portico moment, the country had begun to look at other concerns, but the image endured as a contested symbol. Some political scientists wrote articles that used the episode as a case study in the ethics of transition. They asked whether the public should expect leaders to perform rituals that express mutual respect even when private bonds fail. A few op-eds defended the president, calling his action decisive. Others feared that it set a precedent where protocol was weaponized for personal slight. In local clubs and in the halls of universities, the argument lasted longer than any speech. The episode became a lodestar for those who study how informal norms can be more important than formal rules in maintaining the health of republics. Throughout this narrative, the stories of secondary figures matter. Dean, the policy aide, drafted memos and minutes and tried to anchor decisions in precedent. Clark, a counsel to the president, counseled caution and legacy. James, a mutual confidant, organized dinners and attempted reconnaissance toward peace.
Margaret, who moved between public fashion and private sympathy, wrote to both men hoping for repair. Robert, an old soldier, insisted on the moral obligation of comradeship and attempted quiet diplomacy. Joseph, a committee figure, amplified the outer forces that pressured both men into performances. Eli, the press photographer, preserved the imagery that would forever define the rupture. Each acted in ways that steered the story toward public consequence. Their names appear in letters, in notes, in the margins of history, because decisions rarely travel along. They bring with them the human textures that the official record sometimes omits. There are technicalities and processes that govern the transition and that shaped the scene in ways not obvious to a casual observer. The Protocol Office of the White House maintained a detailed schedule that dictated where limousines would stop and which doors would be used for arrivals. Press briefings were timed in 5-minute increments because the camera crews and the news cycles were calibrated to those slots. The security details required advance notice of guest lists and of the times when doors would open. Such procedural layers meant that the president did not simply decide in a whim to deny a meeting. The order ran through memos, through formal directives, and through staff that executed the refusal with the mechanical clarity of trained administrators. These processes matter because they show the difference between a symbolic gesture and an improvised slight. They also reveal how institutional rules can be used to enact a political choice without a public proclamation. At roughly a third of this account, we pause to acknowledge how you feel about what you have heard. If this part already moved you, you are not alone. This story provokes a basic question about leadership and loyalty that many of us have faced in smaller ways. What would you do in the place of either man when private gratitude conflicts with public duty? Write a line in the comments beginning with "I would defend" or "I would refuse" and share just one sentence. Seeing your answers helps us gather different perspectives and guides future episodes where we explore the moral quandaries of leadership. It also builds a conversation that turns history into a place where we can learn from each other. Now we return to the narrative to see what came next and why that morning at the portico mattered far beyond a photograph. The years that followed turned both men into historical figures whose personal rifts were absorbed into larger national narratives. The president continued to work within the constraints of office, drafting policies and speaking plainly. The general, shaped by the momentum of public favor, moved into political roles that required new compromises. Neither man deserted the memory of their shared service. In private letters that later surfaced, they confessed to mutual admiration and to the sorrow of being estranged from someone with whom victory had once been shared. These letters were modest and human. They spoke of the weather, of small domestic jokes, and of the peculiar loneliness of public life. The letters did not undo the ban, but they complicated its moral arithmetic. 3 substantial tension scenes marked subsequent years. The first involved a hearing where accusations meant to expose disloyalty instead focused the public on the methods of accusation. In that hearing, the smell of old paper and the quiet aridity of the hearing room made the rhetoric feel clinical. Witnesses spoke in clipped voices. Lawyers parsed words into fragments that could be used as weapons. The second tension scene took place in a campaign office 1 week before an election when operatives debated whether to accentuate fear or hope. The air was electric with cigarette smoke and with the nervous energy of volunteers. Voices rose. Men and women argued about tactics in a way that showed how small decisions cascade into public consequence. The third scene occurred after a funeral when the 2 men met quietly and the conversation was less about defense than about accepting endings. Each lasted long enough to change perceptions and short enough to keep mystery in place. The lessons of this story are not merely about 2 famous egos. They are about the fragility of the norms that hold Republican life together and about how individual choices can become institutional precedents. Leadership involves not only the capacity to make decisions, but the willingness to absorb the moral cost of those decisions. Pride has a price. Rituals have force. Public memory often reduces complex human paths to a single arresting image. The photograph of a closed door is as powerful as any long essay, and it can outlive nuance. Yet history can also recover complexity through archives, through the patient work of researchers like Evelyn, the archivist, and through candid letters that reveal the human textures beneath public acts. In the end, both men left legacies that the world would debate for decades. The country they helped shape had grown more complex, media-driven, and susceptible to spectacle. The ban at the White House doorway remained an episode that political scientists and moralists referenced as a case study in how private grievances can become public precedent. It reminded leaders that the small ceremonies of office matter because they signal a shared commitment to something larger than personal triumph. It reminded citizens that symbols can be instruments of both correction and injury. 1 month after the event, the country buzzed with commentary and editorial gravity. 3 months after, scholars began to situate the incident in institutional context and to question how procedural norms could be protected. 6 months down the line, efforts toward personal reconciliation had gained modest ground via intermediaries, while the public debate moved on to other crises. The epilogue thus unfolds as a series of small restorations rather than a single dramatic reconciliation. As you consider this story, think of the small rituals in your own life that hold communities together. Consider whether you would preserve them at the cost of personal grievance. Consider also how societies can protect the integrity of institutions while allowing for the frailty of human feeling. If you found value here, subscribe to the channel to follow future reconstructions of pivotal moments in political life. Share this story with someone who cares about leadership and legacy. Comment below with one sentence that begins, "I would defend" or "I would refuse." The account of the car at the portico is a small and stubborn reminder that history often turns on the hinge of a gesture, and that the cost of pride is rarely paid by only one person.